weird beginning there. You may have seen a computer screen for a second. Here is your final guide of the course. It is a little bit about the final piece we'll be reading, Life in the Iron Mills, and I'm going to kind of put it into context about the changing concepts of work in America. This is actually the only, besides our Lenni Lenape Native American myth, this is really one of the only American pieces that we are reading in this course. And it reverts back to a lot of Romanticism. This goes back to the discussions we had several weeks ago. And I want to frame what happens in this story with what actually is happening in America at the time. We are in America at the time of this piece being written going through some major changes, dealing with economics and particularly dealing with the concept of work. And it put late American romantics on the attack because all of those great romantic notions that romantics sort of held near and dear to their hearts were being crushed. So let's talk about how work has been established in America from the very foundings of America all the way through to this piece. To kind of frame and give you a bit of backstory, I want to go all the way back to the 17th century with the founding of what we know today of America when the New England Puritans came over to the New World. If you know about the Puritans and how sort of deeply rooted they were in religion, all right, we're talking about sort of Christian ideology here. If you're a Christian, which these Puritans were, and you believed in the story of the Garden of Eden, right, and the fall of man, Adam and Eve were essentially told by God to earn a living by working after the fall, right? So the Puritans strongly believed that a good work ethic was absolutely essential. So when they came to the New World, think about it. If you're arriving on a land that is covered in trees, that is not cultivated, you're going to have to work really hard in order to convert that land into something that is usable with the Western mindset, right? So you have to turn that wilderness and wild into a civilized living environment, right? How do you do this? Through manual labor, a lot of chopping, a lot of building, harsh conditions. But the Puritans strongly believe that a good work ethic is what God wanted. It's what made you industrious, right? Moving a little bit ahead, this whole idea of work ethic being, I think, one of the cornerstones of American culture really becomes quite concrete in 1784 with Benjamin Franklin, of all people. Some of you may have read sections of Benjamin Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac. It's a very dense piece of nonfiction where Franklin essentially gives a series of almost catchphrases, things that have trickled down to today even in American culture about what Americans sort of stand for, what American values are, okay? Some of the ones that you may be familiar with, that you've heard, that you probably didn't even realize came from Franklin in his work. One of the things he says in the Almanac is, there are no gains without pains. He that hath a trade hath an estate. If we are industrious, we shall never starve. God gives all things to industry. I think you're starting to see a trend here, right? If you're a hard worker, right, you're going to be okay, right? And that God is going to protect you, right? And in order to be a hard worker, you're going to have to sacrifice a bit, right? The whole idea of an industrious worker becomes something quite American, right? Where Franklin's work actually becomes somewhat dangerous in long-term American ideology is his idea of those who are poor and those who might be unemployed, those who are on the streets, who, you know, we would probably consider as beggars. He suggests that the unfortunates were really victims of their own sloth, or their own misdirected love of, like, foolish luxury. Those who failed to prosper, in short, deserved to fail. They were entirely responsible for their condition and only had themselves to blame. I think this is still in many instances, a way that we as Americans in our American culture view those who are unemployed today. And this whole mindset actually starts way back with Franklin and his particular work. So important to keep this in mind as we move forward here. Where you really start to see a major change in the concept of laborers and the concept of workers, it shifts from the 18th to the 19th century. In the 18th century, most people in an urban environment, or even in a rural environment, if you worked, you were working as an apprentice in workshops, right? It was the master-apprentice system. All genders, sexes, and ages were important to the working process. And that earlier area, the totality of family life, including work and leisure, occurred in close proximity. So if you were an apprentice, if you were a young apprentice, what you would do is essentially learn the trade. You would learn to become a blacksmith from a master craftsman. And if you were an apprentice, you would settle very close to that blacksmith, maybe even in the same house. If you started a family, right, and you married and you had children, they all knew each other because they lived in such close proximity. It was a very intimate living environment. The master craftsman would essentially, get very involved with the family life. They knew who you were, they knew who your family was, they knew your personality, they knew your likes and your dislikes, they knew your strengths and your weaknesses, okay? There's a change with that, though. Around the mid-19th century, the whole idea of master-apprentice changes to what we, I think, see as work today, employer-employee, right? Something a little bit distant there happens. And there's a couple of reasons. One, we start to see industrialization. You see this rapid growth of cities and machines. So what does that do? It creates this separation between home and the workplace. Whereas before, you might have woke up upstairs in the attic with your family, walked downstairs to your master, and work on your trade. Now you're traveling to go to work, right? And there are a heck of a lot more machines that are available. You start to see cities explode in growth. What creates even more separation also in America at the time is the concept of the railroad. Because obviously if you can jump on a train, you're able to separate even further. It creates that distance. So we start to see some major divides begin in the concept of work. And also in the concept of class system. Upper class industry people who owned businesses, people who were professionals and the owners of factories were all men. Okay? So it was a strictly sort of male-dominated role. Those who were in upper class who owned the businesses. The middle class home belonged to women when it boiled right down to it. This is really where we start to see these quote-unquote traditional female role in the house, right? Even what we would call today somewhat feminists of the time period. It really didn't exist, the concept of feminism. But even women writers, this one particular, Sarah Josepha Hale, who was an editor and writer, actually wrote in one of her publications in 1830, "Our men are sufficiently money-making. Let us keep our women and children free." So it was sort of very common knowledge that women and children should not be involved in the workplace. So the low end of the scale, the working class, they're laborers. They are the low-wage workers, right? They are the ones who are going to work and working in these sort of horrid conditions. Now, given this, and looking at the way we start to see the American class system, I think you can start to see why romantics were having almost heart attacks in this time period. It's late American romanticism at this point, which has almost all the same similarities as the European romanticism that we talked about several weeks ago. The whole idea of nature is essentially being desecrated. Everyone is moving to the city and living in these sort of deplorable conditions. The whole idea that the individual is important, that goes right out the window. with this whole concept of industrialization, right? Because if you're a laborer, you are working for one business person who really could care less about who you are as long as the job gets done, right? So many issues here dealing with those core concepts of romanticism. In Life in the Iron Mills, what you're going to see is Rebecca Harding Davis very clearly criticizing what is happening in America and what is happening with humanity in this industrial society. You will meet some particularly very vividly described, almost pathetic, low-level workers. And you're going to see how art comes into play. We talked a little bit about art and romanticism earlier, but you're going to see how art essentially saves one of the characters. And once that character can't create art anymore, he doesn't want to live. So you're going to see some very clear romantic ideals be put to the test in this story. And I'm looking forward to getting your reaction to it on the discussion thread after you read through it.